Today, we're diving into the story of a single grain of rice. It's a grain that feeds half a continent, and it's facing an invisible threat that could change absolutely everything.
Just take a look at this. This isn't just a pretty picture of a farm. For hundreds of millions of people across Southeast Asia, this is everything. It's the bedrock of their culture, their economy, and frankly, their survival. Every single one of those stalks matters.
So let's really get our heads around just how fundamental rice is to this entire region. We're talking about something that's so much more than food. It's a way of life.
Here's the number to remember: 700 million. That's how many people in Southeast Asia depend on rice as their main source of food. To put that in perspective, that's more than double the entire population of the United States. It's just a massive number.
And this chart, wow, it really shows a staggering dependency. For those 700 million people, rice isn't just, a side dish. It makes up about half of every single calorie they eat, every single day. So you can see right away, any threat to rice is a direct threat to their well-being.
But there's a villain in this story. It's an antagonist that's quiet, it's everywhere, and it's getting stronger every single year. Extreme heat.
So what exactly is extreme heat? We're not just talking about a nice hot day at the beach here. We're talking about a long, drawn-out siege of intense heat and humidity. These are conditions that are just brutal for plants, and, as we're about to see, they're incredibly dangerous for the people who have to work out in it.
What we're looking at here are two very different paths into the future. On the left, a world where we have intermediate carbon emissions. On the right, a future with high emissions. You can literally see those temperature lines pulling further and further away from what used to be normal. The choices we make, like right now, are going to decide which one of these paths we go down.
And to put some real numbers on that, let's take a look at Singapore. Right now, it gets about 24 of what are called high heat stress days a year. By 2050, if we're on that intermediate path, that number skyrockets to 87. And in a high emissions world, we're talking 113 days. That's a mind-boggling jump, turning a rare event into a dangerous new normal.
So what does all this heat actually do to the rice harvest? Well, the impact is like a devastating chain reaction, and it hits everything: the plant itself, the land, and of course, the people who farm it.
Okay, this is the number that should really stop you in your tracks. For every single degree Celsius, the average daily high temperature goes up, we could lose 10% of the rice yield.
And that's not just some random guess. It's based on some really careful scientific studies. The research confirms just how fragile our food system is. These tiny changes in temperature can lead to these massive, massive losses in how much food we can grow.
All right, so where's this going to happen? Take a look at these maps. The darkest red areas show the biggest increase in days over 35 degrees Celsius. And as you can see, it's like a bullseye painted directly over the most critical rice-growing areas in all of Southeast Asia. Okay, let's zoom in a little. Here's Thailand. The northern and northeastern regions, that's the country's breadbasket. Or, well, its rice bowl, I guess you'd say. Together, they produce a whopping 74% of the entire country's rice. And if we hop over to Vietnam, it is the exact same story. You've got the Mekong and the Red River deltas. These are responsible for over 70% of Vietnam's total production, and they are right in the path of this intensifying heat.
And finally, Indonesia. The incredibly fertile farmlands on the islands of Java and Sulawesi, which are absolutely crucial for feeding the nation, well, they're facing the same threat. So here's the really scary part. The heat isn't just hitting some marginal farmland. It is targeting the absolute heart of the region's food supply.
And remember, this isn't just about the plants. The millions of farmers who work these fields are facing life-threatening conditions. We're talking about everything from heat exhaustion and just lower productivity, all the way to heat stroke, organ failure, and even a greater spread of diseases like malaria and dengue.
So the threat is clear, it's targeted, and it is extremely dangerous. Which brings us to the big question: is the region actually ready for what's coming? And what this shows us is a huge problem, a real mismatch. Right now, the national climate plans for farming are focused on super important things, don't get me wrong, like floods and droughts. But they are largely unprepared for this very specific, overwhelming challenge of prolonged extreme heat. There's a major gap in the defenses.
The bottom line from researchers is pretty sobering, and you can't really avoid it. The strategies that are in place today are just not enough to protect the region's food supply and its people from this rising tide of heat.
But listen, this isn't just a story about doom and gloom. It's really a call to action.
because experts have laid out a pretty clear blueprint for how we can build a more resilient future. The game plan really has three main parts. First, we have to innovate. We've got to use science to develop new kinds of rice that can actually handle higher temperatures. Second, we have to collaborate. Countries need to work together on things like research, water security, and emergency food supplies. And third, we have to adapt, which really means moving away from relying so heavily on just one single crop. And diversifying means looking at other crops that are just naturally tougher in the heat. Things like sorghum, millets, and cassava could become a huge part of a more secure food future. But, and this is a huge but, this is a massive challenge. You're asking people to shift away from a grain that is just so deeply woven into their culture and who they are.
And look, this kind of innovation doesn't just happen on its own. The key to developing these new heat-tolerant crops is going to come from strong international scientific teamwork, working with world-class groups like the International Rice Research Institute, which actually holds the world's largest library of rice genes.
Which really leaves us with one final thought. The science is clear, our changing climate is fundamentally changing our food. The real challenge now might not be in a lab or a field, but right in our own kitchens. Are we, as a global community, ready to change what's on our plates to make sure everyone has a seat at the table in the future?